there was some sense in continuing these mediations, in that they could potentially result in a partial ceasefire of some sort, perhaps a ceasefire in the air, which would prevent the sort of strikes that we've seen over the last few weeks, which would, while not ending the conflict entirely, would certainly make the lives of ordinary Ukrainians much better.
We're catching up with the Times reporter who is in Lviv in Ukraine, Tom Ball. Tom, another day, another record number of air assaults by Russia overnight. Does the escalation in drone attacks look like stopping anytime soon?
Sadly, no, I think is the straight answer to that. There were more than 700 Shahed drone strikes last night, up from 550 last weekend and 500 the weekend before that. Clearly, Russia is ramping up these attacks, and it's enabled by the fact that it has significantly escalated its production of these drones, not least the fact that it's being helped by Iran in the original design, by China in the components used in it, and reportedly also by North Korean workers. Last year they were producing about 1,000 of these drones. Now it's thought to be about 6,000 of these drones each month, and by some estimates they'll be producing 10,000 by the end of the year. So it's looking very bleak indeed, really, and it could well be at the stage in a few months' time where Russia is launching up to 1,000 drones a night on Ukrainian cities.
And this series of record numbers coming across comes as it seems the close relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin is perhaps cratering.
Yeah, the scales appear to have fallen from Trump's eyes when it comes to Putin. I think he's finally clocked that Putin's been running rings around him and has been playing him essentially ever since he came into office at the start of this year. Trump famously obviously said that he could strike a deal to end the war within 24 hours, which was then extended to a month, which was then extended to 6 months, and so on. I think he realises now that he probably won't be able to do that anytime soon, saying last week that Putin has no intention of stopping the war, and that he's, in his phone calls with the Russian president, had not been able to make any headway at all. So, having not provided Ukraine with any weapons since coming into office, he's now authorised or countermanded the supply of Patriot missiles and other weapon systems that had been stopped by the Pentagon, which is Ukraine is saying it's grateful for, but really is of little comfort, really, given the fact that these are weapons that should have been sent anyway and have been delayed, and also by some reports have also been reduced, with 10 Patriot missiles being sent now rather than 30, which was in the original shipment, ready for delivery last week.
What do we know about the kind of background to that pause in weapons shipments that even now seems to be partially reversed?
According to reports, it was a decision taken unilaterally by the Pentagon, by Pete Hegseth, the Defence Secretary, on the basis of the fact that America didn't have enough of these weapons itself, and would reduce their stockpiles to an unacceptably low level were they to go ahead with the shipments. But then you might question as to why shipments have continued to Israel throughout this period, which used Patriot systems in order to shoot down the barrage that came from Iran during the conflict last month.
It was striking hearing Donald Trump speak at his cabinet meeting on Tuesday. He was pretty downbeat about talks with Putin. Is there a sense Donald Trump is maybe giving up on this push for a ceasefire?
I don't think he's giving up. I think he's very aware of the fact that Joe Biden, that the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which happened under Joe Biden, is something that has tarnished Biden's legacy, and something which Trump himself is more than happy to ram home. So I don't think he would want. I think that's in his mind, and I don't think he would want to have the same legacy himself, were he to wash his hands of Ukraine and totally disengage himself from the process. But I think he's realised that this is not an easy fix, and that the idea that peace can somehow be achieved just by getting two negotiation teams in the room and applying a bit of pressure on both of them isn't going to work in a conflict which goes back many years, many decades, and some would say many centuries.
You've been talking with someone who is very experienced in those sort of negotiations, Maxim Reshetnikov. He's a former Ukrainian defense minister. I think it's fair to say he's pretty gloomy about the prospects for long-term peace.
Yeah, he said he essentially said that he didn't think there could be any peace in Ukraine or any abatement to Russia's war on Ukraine while Vladimir Putin is still in the Kremlin. He described Ukraine as a personal obsession for Putin, and said that even were there to be some kind of ceasefire, Putin would look to subvert it and would continue a hybrid war or a war of some form, in the same way that Russia did following the Minsk agreements that putatively ended the start of the war in 2014. Russia continued subsequently after that to continue to press and continue to launch operations against Ukraine. So he was fairly pessimistic about the prospects for any kind of substantive peace in the short term, but I don't think he's really alone in that. I think there's a growing resignation amongst Ukrainians to a protracted war, which, given the fact that only 6 months ago when Trump came into office there were hopes that he would be able to put pressure on Russia in order to bring them to terms, is quite a stark turnaround, really. But it's something that one is hearing more commonly in Ukraine now.
Do you think that's a fair point to say the death or the removal of Putin from the Kremlin is what it would take? Is the war driven so much by one man's desire? Has the Russian state been that hollowed out? Well,
Reshetnikov's point was essentially that Ukraine, as a liberal, Western-minded democracy, poses an existential threat to Putin's regime, or the regime that Putin has constructed over the last 25 years, and that his regime would never be safe while there is a neighbouring country with deep historical and cultural ties to Russia that shows Russians who live in an autocratic, tyrannical society that there is another way. And his point was that whoever replaces Putin would be unlikely to share in that, would be unlikely to maintain the same regime as he has done, and would instead probably seek a path in which Russia became a more that Russia was concerned more with its economic stability than with waging war on its neighbour, which has ultimately had hugely debilitating effects on the economy due to sanctions, as well as the war footing that the economy has been on for the last 3.5 years.
Given Reshetnikov's background, he's a pretty informed guy. What's his take on the current negotiations? Does he think this is worth keeping on at?
Well, Reshetnikov himself took part in negotiations with the Russians in the early months of the war in Belarus and in Turkey, which essentially he said were the Russians coming to seek Ukraine's capitulation. He hasn't obviously been involved in the latest rounds of negotiations that have taken place this year, but it was his understanding that the Russians' mandate remained unchanged and that they were essentially still seeking to have Ukraine surrender. So, in effect, he said that the purpose of these negotiations on the Russians' part was simply in order to demonstrate to the White House that they were acting in good faith and to avoid provoking Donald Trump's ire and potentially further sanctions. At the same time, though, he did say that he thought they weren't entirely useless and that there was some sense in continuing these mediations, in that they could potentially result in a partial ceasefire of some sort, perhaps a ceasefire in the air, which would prevent the sort of strikes that we've seen over the last few weeks, which would, while not ending the conflict entirely, would certainly make the lives of ordinary Ukrainians much better.
You touched on that growing resignation among ordinary Ukrainians. Is there something that would shift the dial, that's something that Zelensky could have in his pocket that could maybe shuffle that narrative on from resignation?
There have been sanctions against Russia for many years now, and people question their efficacy given the fact that they haven't made any difference whatsoever in terms of Russia's continuation of its war. But there is some who say that further sanctions from the American sanctions potentially, which would target nations that buy, in particular, buy oil from Russia, would have the kind of economic leverage that could potentially push Putin into the negotiation, into making terms with the Ukrainians. That's something that's been floated, but Donald Trump hasn't issued a single new sanction against the Russians since coming into office. So whether or not he does that in the future, I don't know. But from the first 6 months in office, it doesn't look particularly likely anytime soon.
Tom, thank you.